Welcome back, everybody. Today we will be reading Chapter 23, so let's get into it. Chapter 23, The Retreat. Quentin woke up in a beautiful white room. For a second, or was it an hour, a week? He thought it was his room in Brakebill South, that he was back in Antarctica. But then he saw that the window was open and heavy green curtains were puffing in and out and in again with the coming and going of a warm summer wind. So definitely not Antarctica. He lay looking up at the ceiling, letting himself drift and spin along on spacey, narcotic mental currents. He didn't feel even remotely curious about where he was or how he'd gotten there. He blissed out on insignificant details, the sunlight, the smell of clean linens, a splinter of blue sky in the window, the gnarly whirls of the dark chocolate-brown timbers that crossed the whitewashed ceiling. He was alive. And those nice, surprisingly pottery Barney curtains, the color of the stem of plants. They were coarse woven, but it wasn't the familiar, depressing, fake authentic coarseness of high-end earth housewares, which merely imitated the real coarseness of fabrics that were woven by hand out of genuine necessity. As he lay there, Quentin's uppermost thought was that these were authentically coarse woven curtains, woven by people who didn't know any other way of making curtains, who didn't even know that their way was special, and whose way was therefore not discounted and emptied of meaning in advance. This made him very happy. It was as if he'd been looking for these curtains forever, as if he'd been waiting his whole life to wake up one morning in a room in which those coarse-woven stem-green curtains hung over the windows. From time to time, a horsey clippy-clopping could be heard from the hall outside. This mystery solved itself when a woman with the body of a horse stepped part way into the room. The effect was surprisingly unsurprising. She was a sturdy, sun-kissed woman with short brown hair who just happened to be attached to the chassis of a sleek black mare. "You are conscious?" she asked. Quentin cleared his throat. He couldn't get it all the way clear. It was horribly dry, too dry to speak, so he just nodded. "Your recovery is nearly complete," the centauress said, with the air of a busy senior resident doing rounds who didn't have time to waste rejoicing over medical miracles. She began the slow process of reversing herself daintily, purposefully, back out into the hall. "You have been asleep for 6 months and 2 days, she added before she disappeared. Quentin listened to her clippity-clop way. It was quiet again. He did his best to hang on to the blissful feeling, but it didn't last. The 6 months of his recovery were practically a blank, just a quickly evaporating impression of blue depths and complex, enchanted dreams. But Quentin's memories of what happened in Ember's tomb were very clear. He might reasonably have expected that day, or had it been night, to fall in a blackout period, or at least be veiled in merciful post-traumatic haziness, but no, not at all. He could remember it with perfect fidelity, deep focus, full force, from any angle, right up until the moment he lost consciousness. The shock of it snapped his chest flat. It emptied out his lungs the way the beast's jaws had. Not just once, but over and over again. He was helpless against it. He lay in his bed and sobbed until he choked. His weak body spasmed. He made noises he'd never heard a human being make. He ground his face into his flat, prickly straw pillow until it was wet with tears and snot. She had died for him, for all of them, and she was never coming back. He couldn't think about what happened. He could only play it back again and again, as if there were a chance it could come out differently, or even just hurt a little less. But every time he played it back, he wanted to die. His half-healed body ached all over, as if it were bruised right down to his skeleton. But he wanted it to hurt even more. He didn't know how to operate in a world that would allow this to happen. It was a shit world, a fraud and a con, and he wanted nothing more to do with it. Whenever he slept, he woke up trying to warn somebody of something, but he never knew what or who, and it was always too late. With the sorrow came anger. What had they been thinking? A bunch of kids walking into a civil war in an alien world. Alice was dead, and Finn, and probably Penny too. And the worst part was that he could have saved them all, and he hadn't. He was the one who told them it was time to go to Fillory. He'd blown the horn that summoned the beast. Alice had come because of him to take care of him, but he hadn't taken care of her. The centaurs watched him weep with alien unconcern, like fish. He leaned over the next few days he learned over the next few days that he was in a monastery or something like it, or that was as much as he could gather from the centaurs who ran the place. It wasn't a place of worship, they explained, with a note of whinnying condescension, but a community devoted to the most absolute possible expression, or incarnation, or perhaps realization was an even better word, of the incomprehensibly complex but infinitely pure sylvan values of centaurhood, which Quentin's fallen human brain could never hope to grasp. There was something distinctly German about the centaurs. It came out, not very tactfully, that they considered humans to be inferior beings. It wasn't the humans' fault. They were simply cripples, severed by an unhappy accident of birth from their rightful horse halves. The centaurs regarded Quentin with pity nicely tempered by a near total lack of interest. Also, they seemed to be constantly afraid that he was going to tip over. None of them had any exact memory of how Quentin had gotten here. They didn't pay close attention to the backstory of the occasional damaged human who fetched up in their midst. When pressed, Quentin's doctor, a terrifyingly earnest individual whose name was Alder Acorn Agnes Allison Fragrant Timber, said she vaguely remembered some humans, unusually filthy and bedraggled specimens, now that you mention it, bringing Quentin in on a makeshift litter. He'd been unconscious and deep in shock with his ribcage crushed and one of his forelimbs badly dislocated, practically detached. Such anatomical disorder was distasteful to the centaurs, and they were not insensible of the service the humans had rendered to Fillory in ridding it of Martin Chatwin. They did their best to render assistance. The humans lingered in the area for a month, maybe 2, while the centaurs wove deep webs and wood magic around Quentin's torn, bruised, insulted body. But they thought it unlikely that he would ever wake up. And in time, as Quentin showed no signs of recovering consciousness, the humans reluctantly departed. He supposed he could have been angry that they had left him there in Fillory, with no way of returning to his own world, but all he felt was warm, cowardly relief. He didn't have to face them. The sight of their faces would have burned the skin right off him with shame. He wished he had died, and if he couldn't have death, at least he had this, the next best thing. Total isolation, lost forever in Fillory. He was broken in a way that magic could never fix. His body was still weak, and he spent a lot of time in bed, resting his atrophied muscles. He was an empty shell, roughly hollowed out by some crude tool, gutted and left there, a limp, raw, boneless skin. If he tried, he could summon up old sense memories, Nothing from Fillory or Breakbills, just the really old stuff, the easy stuff, the safe stuff. The smell of his mother's oil paints, the lurid green of the Gonus Canal, the curious way Julia pursed her lips around the reed of her oboe, the hurricane that blew through when they took the family vacation in Maine. He must have been about 8. When they went out on the lawn and threw their sweaters in the air and watched them sail away over the neighbor's fence and then fell down laughing. A beautiful blossoming white cherry tree stood outside his window in the warm afternoon sunlight. Every part of it moved and swayed in a slightly different rhythm from every other part. He watched it for a long time. If he was feeling daring, he thought about the time he'd spent as a goose flying south, wingtip to wingtip with Alice, buoyed up by pillowy masses of empty air, gazing coolly down at looping, squiggly, switch-backed rivers. If he did it now, he thought, he would remember to look out for the Nazca lines in Peru. He wondered if he could go back to Professor Vanderweeg and have her change him back. And he would just stay that way, live and die as a stupid goose, and forget that he'd ever even been a human. Sometimes he thought of a day he'd spent with Alice on the roof of the cottage. They had a joke that they were going to play on the others when they got back from somewhere, but the others never came home, and he and Alice had just lain up there on the warm shingles all afternoon, looking at the sky and talking about nothing. A few days of this went a long way. His body was healing fast and getting restless, and his brain was waking up and needing new diversions to distract it. It wouldn't leave him alone for long. Onward and upward. He couldn't stop himself from getting better. Soon, Quentin was out and about and exploring the grounds, a walking skeleton. Severed from his past and from everything and everyone he knew, he felt as insubstantial and semi-existent as a ghost. The monastery, the centaur's name for it was the Retreat, was all stone colonnades and towering trees and wide, well-manipulated paths, maintained paths. Despite himself, he was ravenously hungry, and although the centaurs were strict vegetarians, they turned out to be wizards with salad. At mealtimes, they set out huge heaping wooden troughs full of spinach and lettuce and arugula and sharp dandelion greens, all delicately oiled and spiced. He discovered the centaur baths, 6 rectangular stone pools of varying temperatures, each one large enough that he could do 3 long, deep breaststrokes from one edge to the other. They reminded him of the Roman baths in Alice's parents' house. And they were deep, too. If he dove in and kicked downward with enough vigor until the light dimmed and his hind brain complained and the water pressure forced its fingers into his ears, he could still just barely brush the rough stone bottom with his fingers. His mind was an icy pond constantly in danger of thawing. He trod on it only lightly. Its surface was perilously slick, and who knew how thin. To break through would mean immersion in what was below. Cold, dark, anaerobic water and angry, toothy fish. The fish were memories. He wanted to put them away somewhere and forget where he'd put them. But he couldn't. The ice gave way at the oddest moments. When a fluffy talking chipmunk looked up at him quizzically, when a centaur nurse was inadvertently kind to him, when he caught a glimpse of his face in a mirror, something hideous and saurian would rise up and his eyes would flood and he would wrench himself away. The grief he felt for Alice kept unfolding new dimensions he hadn't known were there. He felt like he'd only seen and loved her, really loved her, all of her, for those last few hours. Now she was gone. Broken like the glass animal she'd made that first day they'd met, and the rest of his life lay in front of him like a barren, meaningless postscript. For the first few weeks after his resurrection, Quentin still felt deep aches in his chest and shoulder, but they faded as more weeks piled on top of those first few. He was at first shocked and subsequently kind of fascinated to discover that the centaurs had replaced the skin and muscle tissue he'd lost to the beast with something that looked very much like dark, fine-grained wood. 2/3 of his collarbone and most of his right shoulder and biceps now appeared to be composed of a smooth, highly polished fruit wood, cherry maybe, or possibly apple. The new tissue was completely numb. He could tap on it with his knuckles and not feel a thing, but it was perfectly able to flex and bend when and where he needed it to. And it merged gracefully with the flesh around it, without a seam. He liked it. Quentin's right knee was wooden now, too. He couldn't actually remember having injured that particular part of him, but whatever. Maybe something untoward had happened to it on the way back. And there was another change. His hair had gone completely white, even his eyebrows, like the man in Poe's descent into the maelstrom. He looked like he was wearing an Andy Warhol wig. He would do anything to keep from sitting still. He practiced with a bow and arrow on a wide, disused, weed-grown archery range. When he could get his attention, he had one of the younger centaurs teach him the rudiments of riding and fencing with a saber, in the name of physical therapy. Sometimes he pretended his sparring partner was Martin Chatwin. Sometimes he didn't. Either way, he never once landed a hit. A small contingent of talking animals had discovered Quentin's presence at the retreat. A badger and some oversized talking rabbits. Excited by the sight and smell of a human, and from Earth at that, they had gotten it into their heads that he was the next High King of Fillory. And when he angrily insisted that he wasn't, and that he'd lost all interest in the particular ambition, they dubbed him the Reluctant King, and left tributes of nuts and cabbages outside his windows, and constructed pathetic handmade or paw-made crowns for him woven out of twigs and adorned with worthless quartz pebbles. He tore them apart. A small herd of tame horses roamed the wide lawns of the retreat at will. At first Quentin thought they were just pets, but the arrangement turned out to be slightly more complex than that. Centaurs of both sexes frequently copulated with the horses publicly and loudly. Quentin had found his few meager possessions stacked in little piles along one wall of his room. He stowed them in a dresser. They took up exactly half of one of its 5 drawers. His room also held a battered old Florida-style writing desk, painted white and pale green. And one day, Quentin went rummaging through its warped, poorly fitted drawers to see what previous inmates might have left behind. It had occurred to him to attempt some written magic, a basic scrying technique, to try to learn something about what had happened to the others. It almost certainly wouldn't work between planes, but you never knew. Along with an assortment of odd buttons and dried-out chestnuts and exotic Fillorian insect corpses, he found two envelopes. Also in the desk was a dry, tough, leafy branch. The envelopes were thick and made of the coarse, bleached white paper the centaurs made. On the first, his name was written in an elegant calligraphic handwriting that Quentin recognized as Eliot's. His vision swam. He had to sit down. Inside it was a note. It was rolled around and flattened, dehydrated remains of what was once a single Merit Ultralight cigarette. And it read as follows. Dear Q, hell of a thing getting you out of that dungeon. Richard showed up, finally, for which I suppose we should be grateful, though God knows he doesn't make it easy. He wanted to stay, Q, but it was hard, and getting harder every day. The centaur said it wasn't working, but if you're reading this, then you woke up after all. I'm sorry about everything. I know you are too. I know I said I didn't need a family to become who I was supposed to be, but it turned out that I did, and it was you. We'll meet again. E. The other envelope contained a notebook. It was thick and old-looking and squashed around the corners. Quentin recognized it instantly, even though he hadn't seen it since a chilly November afternoon 6 years ago. With a cold, clear mind, he sat down on his bed and opened The Magicians. The book was disappointingly short, maybe 50 handwritten pages, some of them smudged and water-damaged, and it was not written in Christopher Plover's usual plain, simple, open-hearted prose. It was cruder, funnier, more arch, and it showed signs of having been scribbled in haste, with a generous assortment of misspellings and missing words. This was because it wasn't written by Christopher Plover at all. It was, the author explained in the first paragraph, the first book of Fillory and Further by somebody who had actually been there. That person was Jane Chatwin. The story of the Magicians picked up immediately after the end of The Wandering Dune, after Jane, the youngest, and her sister Helen, that dear self-righteous busybody, quarreled over Helen's hiding of the magic buttons that could take them to Fillory. Having failed to unearth them herself, Jane was forced to wait. But no further invitations to Fillory arrived. She and her siblings seemed fated to live out the rest of their lives on Earth as ordinary children. She supposed it was all right. After all, most children never got to go to Fillory at all. But it hardly seemed fair. The others had all gone to Fillory at least twice, and she'd only gotten to go once. And there was the matter of Martin. He was still missing after all this time. Their parents had long since given up hope, but the children hadn't. At night, Jane and the other little Chatwins crept into each other's bedrooms and whispered about him, wondering what adventures he was getting up to in Fillory, and when he would finally come home to them, as they knew he one day would. Years passed. Jane was 13, no longer a girl, as old as Martin was when he'd disappeared, when the call finally came. She was visited by a cooperative and industrious hedgehog named Prickleplump, who helped her recover an old cigar box containing the buttons from the old dry well, down which Helen had dropped it. She could have enlisted one of the others to come with her, but instead Jane returned to Fillory alone, by way of the city, the only Chatwin ever to enter the other world without a sibling to keep her company. She found Fillory beset by a powerful wind. It blew and never stopped blowing. At first, it was amusing, and everybody flew kites in a craze for flowy clothing that billowed out on the breeze swept through the royal court at Whitespire. But over time, the wind became relentless. The birds were exhausted from struggling with it, and everybody's hair was getting tangled. The leaves were being stripped from the forest, and the trees were complaining. Even when you went inside and closed the door, you could still hear it groaning and feel it blowing on your face for hours afterward. Castle Whitespire's wind-powered clockwork heart threatened to spin out of control and had to be decoupled from its windmills and halted for the first time in living memory. A group of eagles and griffins and pegasi allowed themselves to be borne away on the wind, convinced that it would blow them away to a fantastical land, one even more magical than Fillory. They returned a week later, coming from the other direction, hungry and disheveled and wind-burned. They refused to discuss what they had seen. Jane belted on a rapier, put her hair up in a tight bun, and set off into the darkling woods alone, resolute, bent forward against the gale, heading upwind in search of its source. Soon she came across Ember, alone in a clearing. He was injured and distraught. He told her of Martin's transformation and his efforts to expel the child, which had ended with the death of Umber. They held a council of war. With a bellowing bleat Ember summoned the cozy horse, and together they mounted its broad velvet back and set off to see the dwarves, swing players at the best of times. The dwarves could never be relied upon to cooperate with anybody, but even they were convinced that Martin was dangerous, and besides, all that wind was blowing the topsoil off their beloved underground warrens. They fashioned for Jane a silver pocket watch, a work of consummate horological mastery, so dense with tiny gears and cams and glorious spiral springs that its interior was a solid teeming mass of gleaming clockwork. With it, the dwarves explained, Jane could control the flow of time itself, and turn it forward, turn it back, speed it up, slow it down, as she liked. Jane and Ember left with the pocket watch, shaking their heads. Honestly, there was never any telling what the dwarves were capable of. If they could build a time machine, you wondered why they didn't run the whole kingdom. Except, she supposed, that they couldn't be bothered. Quentin turned the last page. The book ended there. It was signed on the bottom of the last page by Jane herself. Well, that was anticlimactic, Quentin said out loud. The truth doesn't always make a good story, does it? But I think I tied up most of the loose ends. I'm sure you can fill in the rest if you really think about it. Quentin practically jumped out of what was left of his skin. Sitting on top of his desk, on the other side of the room, very still, long legs crossed, was a small, pretty woman with dark hair and pale skin. At least I try to make a good entrance. She had gone native. She wore a light brown cloak over a practical gray traveling dress that was slit up the sides far enough to show some leg, but it was unmistakably her, the paramedic, and the woman who'd visited him in the infirmary. And yet, that wasn't who she was at all. You're Jane Chatwin, aren't you? She smiled brightly and nodded. I autographed it. She pointed to the manuscript. Imagine what it would be worth. Sometimes I think about turning up at a Fillory convention just to see what would happen. They'd probably think you were a cosplayer, Quentin said, and getting a little old for it. He set aside the manuscript on the bed. He had been very young when he met her for the first time, but he wasn't young anymore. As her brother Martin would have said, my, how he'd grown. Her smile was not as irresistible as it used to be. You were the Watcher woman, too, weren't you? Was, and am. Still sitting, she sketched a curtsy. I suppose I could retire now that Martin is gone. Though really, I've only just started to enjoy myself. He expected himself to smile back at her, but the smile did not materialize. He didn't feel like smiling. Quentin couldn't have said exactly what he was feeling. Jane remained very still, studying him as she had that first day they met. Her presence was so laden with magic and meaning and history that she almost glowed. To think she had spoken to Plover himself and told him the stories Quentin had grown up on. The circularity of it all was dizzying. The sun was setting, and the light stained Quentin's white bedspread a dusky orange-pink. The edges of everything were softening in the twilight. This doesn't make any sense, he said. He had never felt less tempted by a pretty woman's charms. If you were the Watcher woman, why did you do all those things? Stop time and all that. She smiled wryly. This item? She produced a silver pocket watch as thick and round as a pomegranate from somewhere in her cloak. Did not come with an instruction manual. It took a bit of experimenting before I got the hang of it, and some of those experiments weren't so successful. There was one long afternoon in particular, she grimaced. Her accent was the twin of Martin's. People took it the wrong way, and anyhow, Plover embroidered all that stuff. That was imagination. What an imagination that man had. She shook her head as if Plover's flights of fancy were the most incredible part of all this. And you know, I was only 13 when I started out. I had no training in magic at all. I had to figure everything out on my own. I suppose I'm a bit of a hedge witch that way. So all those things the Watcher woman did, a lot of it did actually happen, but I was careful. The Watcher woman never killed anyone. I cut corners, sometimes at other people's expense, but I had other things on my mind. My job was to stop Martin, and I did what I had to. Even those clock trees, she snorted ruefully. Brilliant idea those were. They never did a bloody thing. The funniest part is that Martin was terrified of them. He couldn't figure them out. For a moment, her face lost its composure. Just for a moment. Her eyes welled with tears, and she blinked rapidly. I keep telling myself that we lost him that first night when he walked away into the forest. It was never him after that, not really. He died a long time ago, and I'm the only Chatwin left now. He was a monster, but he was the last family I had. And we killed him, Quentin said coldly. His heart was palpitating. The feeling he'd had trouble identifying earlier was clarifying itself. It was rage. This woman had used him, used them all like toys. And if some of the toys got broken, oh well. That had been the real point of the whole story all along. She had manipulated him, sent him and the others into Fillory to find Martin. She had made sure he got there. For all he knew, she'd planted the button for Lovelady to find in the first place. It didn't matter now. It was over, and Alice was dead. He stood up. A cool, grassy evening breeze stirred the green curtains. Yes, Jane Chatwin said carefully. You killed him. We won. We won? He was incredulous. He couldn't hold back anymore. All the grief and guilt he'd been salting away so carefully was coming back to him as anger. The ice was cracking. The pond was boiling. We won? You have a damn time machine in your pocket and that's the best you could do? You set us up, Jane, or whoever the fuck you are. We thought we were going on an adventure and you sent us on a suicide mission. And now my friends are dead. Alice is dead. Here, he had to swallow hard before he could go on. Is that really the best you could do? She dropped her eyes to the floor. I am sorry. You're sorry? The woman was unbelievable. Good. Show me how sorry you are. Take me back. Use the watch. We'll go back in time. We'll do it all again. Let's go back and fix this. No, Quentin, she said gravely. We can't go back. What do you mean, no? We can go back. We can, and we will. He was talking at her louder and louder, staring at her, as if, by talking and staring, he could force her into doing what he needed her to do. She had to. And if talking wouldn't do it, he could make her. She was a small woman, and apart from that watch, he was willing to bet that he was twice the magician she'd ever be. She was shaking her head sadly. You have to understand. She didn't back away. She spoke softly as if she could soothe him, placate him into forgetting what she'd done. I'm a witch. I'm not a god. I've tried this so many ways. I've gone down so many different timelines. I've sent so many other people to fight Martin. Don't make me lecture you on the practicalities of chronological manipulation, Quentin. Change one variable and you change them all. Did you think you were the first one to face Martin in that room? Do you think that was even the first time you faced him? That battle has been fought again and again. I've tried it so many different ways. Everyone always died, and I always wound back the clock. As bad as it was, as bad as it is, this is by far the best outcome I've ever achieved. No one ever stopped him, but you and your friends, Quentin. You were the only ones, and I'm sticking with it. I can't risk losing everything we've gained. Quentin folded his arms. Muscles were jumping in his back. He was practically vibrating with fury. Well then, we'll go back all the way to before the world in the world in the walls. Stop him before it all starts. Find a timeline where he doesn't even go to Fillory. I've tried, Quentin, I've tried. She was pleading with him. He always does. I've tried it 1,000 times. There is no world where he doesn't. I'm tired. I know you lost Alice. I lost my brother. I'm tired of fighting that thing that used to be Martin. Suddenly, she did look very tired, and her eyes lost their focus, as if she were seeing into some other world, one she would never get to. It made it hard for him to keep up his high-pressure rage. It kept bleeding away even as he stoked it. This wasn't over. He lunged, but she saw it coming. He was quick, but she was quicker. Maybe they'd played this scene already, in another timeline, or maybe he was just that obvious. Before he was halfway across the room, she spun on her heel and threw the silver watch as hard as she could at the wall. It was hard enough. The wall was stone, and the watch squashed like an overripe fruit. It made a sound like a bag of nickels. The delicate crystal face shattered, and tiny gears and wheels skidded away across the floor like pearls from a broken necklace. Jane turned back to him defiantly, breathing hard. He stared down at the corpse of the broken timepiece. No more, she said. Put an end to it. It's time to live with what we have and mourn what we lost. I wish I could have told you more before it was too late, but I needed you too much to tell you the truth. In a curious gesture, she placed her hands on his chest, drew his face down to hers, and kissed him on the forehead. The room was almost dark now. The door creaked in the quiet spring evening as she opened it. Try not to judge Martin too harshly, she said from the doorway. Plover used to diddle him whenever he could get him alone. I think that's why he went to Fillory in the first place. Why else would he try to crawl into a grandfather clock? He was looking for somewhere to hide. With that, she was gone. Quentin didn't go after her, just stared at the doorway for a long minute. When he walked over to the door to close it, pieces of the broken watch scrunched under his feet. It just went down and down. Had he finally gotten to the bottom of it? In the last of the dying light, he looked down at the notebook on his hard centaur bed. There was a note tucked into the pages. The same one the wind had snatched away from him the first time he tried to read it. But all it said was, "Surprise!" He sat back down. In the end, he and Alice had just been bit players, extras who had the bad luck to wander into a battle scene, a brother and sister at war with each other in their nightmare nursery fantasy land. No one cared that Alice was dead, and no one cared that he wasn't. Now he had answers, but they weren't doing what answers were supposed to do. They weren't making things simpler or easier. They were helping. They weren't helping. Sitting there on his bed, he thought about Alice, and poor stupid Penny, and miserable Elliot, and that poor bastard Martin Chatwin. He got it now, of course, finally. He'd been going about this all wrong. He should never have come here at all. He should never have fallen in love with Alice. He should never even have come to Brakebills. He should have stayed in Brooklyn, in the real world. He should have nursed his depression and his grudge against the world from the relative safety of mundane reality. He never would have met Alice, but at least she would be alive, somewhere. He could have eked out his sad, wasted life with movies and books and masturbation and alcohol like everyone did. He would never have known the horror of really getting what he thought he wanted. He could have spared himself and everybody else the cost of it. If there was a moral to the story of Martin Chatwin, that was it in a nutshell. Sure, you can live out your dreams, but it'll only turn you into a monster. Better to stay home and do card tricks in your bedroom instead. It was partly Jane's fault, of course. She had lured him on at every turn. Well, he wouldn't get fooled again. He wouldn't give anybody the chance. Quentin felt a new attitude of detachment descend on him. His molten anger and grief were cooling into a glossy protective coating, a hard, transparent lacquer of uncaring. If he couldn't go back, he would just have to do things differently going forward. He felt how infinitely safer and more sound this attitude was. The trick was just not wanting anything. That was power. That was courage. The courage not to love anyone or hope for anything. The funny thing about it was how easy everything got when nothing mattered. Over the next few weeks, the new Quentin, with his white Warhol hair and his wooden Pinocchio shoulder, took up his magical studies again. What was wanted now was control. He wanted to be untouchable. In his little cell, Quentin practiced things he'd never had time to master before, or never dared to try. He went back to the most advanced pauper exercises, gruesomely difficult, only theoretically executable etudes that he'd faked his way through back at Brakebills. Now he repeated them over and over again, smoothing out the rough edges. He invented new, even crueler versions, and mastered them as well. He relished the pain in his hands. Ate it up. His enchantments took on a power and precision and fluency they'd never had before. His fingertips left tracks of fire and sparks and neon indigo smears in the air that buzzed and whined, too bright to look at directly. His brain glowed with cold, brittle triumph. This was what Penny had been looking for when he went to Maine. But Quentin was actually doing it. Only now, he thought, now that he had killed off his human emotions, only now that he didn't care anymore, could he wield truly superhuman power. As the sweet spring air drifted through his room, and then the oven-hot summer air and sweat poured down his face, and the centaurs trotted by outside his door, lofty and incurious, he came to see how Mayakovsky had performed some of the feats Quentin had found so baffling. In an empty meadow, he carefully reverse-engineered Penny's flashy fireball spell. He found and corrected the mistakes he'd made in his senior project, the trip to the moon, and he finished Alice's project too, in memoriam. Isolating and capturing a single photon and even observing it. Heisenberg be damned. An infinitely furious, precious, incandescent little wave spark. Seated in the lotus position on top of the sun-faded Florida desk, he allowed his mind to expand until it encompassed 1, then 3 more, then 6 field mice in all, as they went about their tiny urgent business in the grass outside his window. He summoned them to sit before him, and with a thought, gently extinguished the electrical current that lived within each of them. Their little fluffy bodies went still and cold. Then, just as easily, he touched each of them with magic, instantly relighting their tiny souls as if he were touching a match to the pilot light of a stove. He panicked. They scrambled in all directions. He let them go. Alone in his room, he smiled at his secret greatness. He felt loudly the munificent, Jesus. And he tampered with the sacred mystery of life and death. What else was there in this world that could engage his attention? Or in any world? June ripened into July, then burst and withered and dried and became August. One morning, Quentin woke up early to find a cool mist hanging low over the lawn outside his first floor window. Standing there in plain view, looking huge and ethereal, was a white stag. It bent to crop the grass with its small mouth, tilting its grand, top-heavy rack of antlers, and he could see the muscles working in its neck. Its ears were bigger and floppier than he would have expected. It raised its head again, when Quentin appeared in the window, conscious of being observed, then sauntered off across the lawn and disappeared unhurriedly from view. Frowning, Quentin watched it go. He went back to bed but couldn't sleep. Later in the day, he sought out Alder Acorn Agnes Allison Fragrant Timber. He found her working an elaborate room-sized loom, built to harness both the pumping power of her muscular back legs and the delicate manipulations of her human fingers. "The questing beast," she said, breathing hard, still pumping, her hands still weaving. "It is a rare sight. Undoubtedly it was drawn here by the positive energies radiated by our superior values. You are fortunate that it offered itself to some centaur's sight while you happened to be watching." The questing beast, from the girl who told time. So that was what it looked like. Somehow he'd expected something more ferocious. Quentin patted Agnes on her glossy back hindquarters and left. He knew what he had to do. That night, he took out the leafy branch he had found in the writing desk. It was the branch that had hung in front of the beast's face, which it had tossed aside right before their battle. The branch was dead and dried now, but its leaves were still olive and rubbery. He stuck its hard stem in the moist turf and mounded up some dirt to make sure it stayed upright. The next morning, Quentin woke to find a fully grown tree outside his window. Set into its trunk was the face of a softly ticking clock. He put his hand on the tree's hard gray trunk, feeling its cool, dusty back, then let it drop. His time here was over. He packed a few possessions, abandoned others, stole a bow and a quiver of arrows from the shed by the archery range, liberated a horse from the centaur's feral sex herd, and left the retreat. All right, and that's it for today. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 24.